There is a quiet reason why Britain does not look exactly like the rest of Europe, not in a simple way, not in the way old myths once tried to explain it, and certainly not in the language of purity, because no island with this much invasion, migration, hunger, disease, marriage, conquest, and forgetting can ever be called pure. The truth is older, stranger, and much more human than that. It begins before Britain was Britain, before London, before Rome, before the Celts, before Stonehenge, before even the sea had finished drawing the edges of the island. It begins on a wide, low plain now hidden beneath the cold gray water of the North Sea, where deer moved through mist, rivers crossed what is now ocean, and small bands of people walked across land that no longer exists. Tonight, we follow that vanished road backward through 12,000 years of human memory. We will move slowly, from the drowned world of Doggerland to the dark-eyed hunters of the Mesolithic, from the first farmers who brought cattle and seed, to the Beaker people whose arrival changed the genetic future of the island more deeply than almost any king or empire ever would. And as the story unfolds, there is no need to hold every name, every date, or every number. Let them pass like distant lights on water. This is a quiet history, meant to be listened to in the dark, with the room soft around you and the body slowly letting go. The story will remain here, moving gently onward, even as your thoughts grow heavier, and the long island of Britain begins to form beneath the tide. There is a quiet pattern in the faces of the British Isles, visible not as a border, not as a rule, and never as a simple category, but as a soft historical residue left behind by thousands of years of movement. It appears in pale skin that often reddens quickly under summer light, in gray and blue eyes that occur with unusual frequency, in red and auburn hair along the Atlantic edge, in the long-boned build found in some northern and western regions, and in the subtle differences between England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Orkney, Cornwall, and the smaller islands, scattered under the wind. These traits do not belong to one people in any pure or sealed sense. They are not badges of origin, and they are not fixed meanings. They are the visible surface of a much older process, a process made of climate, migration, hunger, marriage, disease, isolation, and chance. The modern face of Britain is not a single face at all. It is a layered landscape, carried in skin, bone, hair, and blood, shaped by events that began long before any king, empire, language, or nation gave the island a name. The first mistake is to imagine that appearance comes from stillness. The British Isles have never truly been still. Their modern populations are often described through national names, but those names are recent compared with the age of the bodies that carry them. Beneath England lies an older England. Beneath Wales, an older Wales. Beneath Ireland and Scotland, older coastlines of ancestry that do not obey modern maps. A person standing on a rainy street in Manchester, a farm road in County Kerry, a harbor in Orkney, or a valley in Snowdonia may seem completely modern, yet the body carries traces from worlds that disappeared in deep time. Some of those traces come from hunters who followed deer across cold open plains. Some come from farmers who crossed the water with cattle, seeds, and polished stone axes. Some come from people of the Bronze Age whose ancestry reached back toward the steppe grasslands far to the east. Others come from Germanic-speaking settlers, Norse seafarers, Roman period migrants, medieval traders, and many later movements that continue into the present. This is why the story cannot be told as a tale of purity. The word itself collapses under the weight of the evidence. Britain is an island, but it is not a sealed container. It is a shore, and a shore is always receiving and losing. Waves bring people in, weather carries them away. Ships arrive in quiet coves and crowded ports. Armies cross narrow water. Families remain. Children are born. Languages change. Old names survive in one valley and disappear in another. Over enough time, a population becomes less like a single line and more like a sedimentary cliff, where each band of color marks a different age. The surface may look continuous from a distance, but close inspection reveals layers, breaks, intrusions, and older foundations exposed by erosion. The visible traits most associated with northwestern Europe are not ancient in the way many people assume. Pale skin, for example, is not the original condition of the first people who lived in Britain after the ice retreated. The oldest important human layer in the island story likely includes people with darker skin and, in some cases, light eyes. That combination feels unexpected to modern imagination only because modern imagination has been trained by recent populations. Biology has no duty to match those expectations. The genes that influence eye color and the genes that influence skin pigmentation do not move through history as one single package. They can separate, recombine, disappear, return, and rise in frequency when the environment makes them useful or when small populations carry them by chance. The pale skin that later becomes common across the British Isles has its own slow logic. Britain sits at high latitude, under a sky where sunlight is often weak, low, and filtered through cloud. In such places, ultraviolet light becomes precious because the human body uses it to produce vitamin D. Darker skin protects well against strong sunlight, but in the northern edges of Europe, it can reduce vitamin D production when diets do not fully compensate. Across many generations, even a small advantage can matter. A child who grows stronger bones, a mother whose body handles pregnancy better, a community with slightly improved resistance to disease. All of this can shift the future without any single dramatic moment. Natural selection rarely needs spectacle. It works quietly, in births, recoveries, winters survived, and children who live long enough to have children of their own. Blue and gray eyes follow a different path. Their high frequency in Britain and Ireland is not simply a result of cloudy weather or island life. It comes from older genetic currents moving through Western and Northern Europe. The same is true of red hair, though red hair belongs especially to the Atlantic fringe, where isolation, founder effects, and chance amplify rare variants over long periods. In Ireland, Western Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and nearby Atlantic regions, the geography itself becomes a kind of slow genetic chamber. Mountains, seas, islands, peninsulas, and long distances from large continental population centers allow uncommon traits to remain visible. A red-haired child in a coastal village is not the beginning of a mystery. The child is a brief living expression of a very old pattern that has passed through countless bodies before reaching the present. The same deep history also lives in what cannot be seen. One of the clearest examples is the ability to digest milk into adulthood. Most humans, across most of the world and most of history, lose much of this ability after infancy. In parts of northwestern Europe, however, adult milk digestion becomes unusually common. This is not just a dietary curiosity. It reveals a world of cattle, dairying, cold seasons, calories stored in living animals, and communities that learn to draw nourishment from milk long after childhood. In Britain, this trait becomes part of the inherited legacy of later prehistoric populations, especially those connected to the Bronze Age transformations that reshape much of Europe. A glass of milk in a modern kitchen therefore carries a quiet echo of ancient herding economies, of cattle moving through damp grass, of people whose bodies and customs became linked tightly enough that culture and gene selection began to move together. Height, too, belongs to the long story, though it is never controlled by one simple cause. It is shaped by thousands of genetic variants, by childhood nutrition, by disease, by labor, by inequality, and by environment. Still, the arrival of populations with steppe-related ancestry during the Bronze Age appears to contribute to changes in average stature in parts of Europe, including Britain. The body becomes a record of movement across landscapes, not because one migration explains everything, but because each migration adds material to the old foundation. The British Isles do not become physically distinct through one event. They become distinct through accumulation. This accumulation differs from region to region. England is not genetically identical from east to west. Wales retains a stronger continuity, with older British layers in many studies. Ireland follows its own island story, with less Anglo-Saxon input and a powerful Atlantic signature. Scotland is deeply varied, with lowland, highland, island, Norse, Gaelic, and older British strands crossing one another. Orkney and Shetland preserve a strong northern imprint from Norse settlement. Cornwall sits with its own partial distinctiveness at the far southwestern edge. These differences are not walls, they are gradients. Human history rarely draws sharp lines unless politics forces them onto maps. Biology usually spreads like mist through valleys, thicker in some places, thinner in others, changed by distance, marriage, travel, and time. The modern face of Britain, then, is not a mystery solved by one invasion, one tribe, or one ancient people. It is the result of repeated arrivals and disappearances, of seas rising and fields spreading, of disease passing through crowded settlements, of small communities on islands, keeping traits that might have faded elsewhere, of large migrations altering the balance without erasing every older trace. It is the story of a place that seems solid on a map, but has always been porous at its edges. The faces seen today are not relics frozen from the past. They are living mixtures, still changing, still receiving new layers, still carrying faint signals from landscapes that no longer exist. To understand them, the story has to move backward, beyond the modern city, beyond medieval kingdoms, beyond Rome, beyond the Iron Age hill fort, beyond the stone circle standing on open grass. It has to return to a time when the island is not yet fully an island, when the North Sea is not yet sea, when a wide plain lies under cold light and human footprints press into damp ground that will one day vanish beneath gray water. The journey begins there, not with a nation, but with a landscape before the nation, before the name, and before the shore has taken its final shape. Before Britain is an island, it is a passage. Land stretches where the North Sea now lies, low and open beneath a cold sky, crossed by rivers, marshes, grasslands, pockets of birch and pine, and long trails made by animals moving between seasons. This world is now mostly hidden beneath water, but for thousands of years it is real ground, not a metaphor and not a myth. It is a place where feet sink into damp soil, where flint tools strike sparks from stone, where red deer move through morning mist, and where families follow the slow habits of the land. The name later given to this vanished country is Doggerland, drawn from Dogger Bank, one of the shallow remains of that older landscape. But the people living there do not know it as a lost world. To them, it is simply home. At the end of the last ice age, the map of northwestern Europe looks unfamiliar. Vast amounts of water are still locked inside glaciers and ice sheets, so the seas sit lower than they do now. The coast is farther away. The English Channel is not yet the hard separation it becomes later. The land that will one day be eastern England opens eastward into a wide plain connected to what are now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Rivers flow through valleys that are now submerged. The Thames is part of a broader drainage system, joined to other waters that move across the exposed shelf before reaching the distant Atlantic. A person can pass from the future island of Britain into continental Europe without crossing open sea. The idea of Britain as separate has not yet been born. This matters because geography is never just scenery. It decides who can move, who can meet, who can marry, who can trade, and who remains apart. Before the sea closes in, the human communities of this region are part of a broader world of Western and Northern Europe. They are not trapped on an island. They live in a landscape of roots. Herds move, and people move after them. Rivers guide travel through reeds and low woodland. Coastal edges shift with season and storm. The early human story of Britain is therefore not a story of isolation at first. It begins as a story of connection. The people who live across this land are hunter-gatherers, but the term can sound too thin for what their lives require. They do not simply wander at random. Their movement follows knowledge built over generations. They know where hazelnuts ripen, where fish gather in the rivers, where deer cross open ground, where flint can be found, where water remains clean, and where winter shelter can be made. The landscape is read through tracks, birdsong, wind direction, animal droppings, broken branches, the texture of mud, the smell of wet ground, and the memory of old camps. A forest is not an empty green mass. It is a map of food, risk, medicine, shelter, and story. The climate is still changing. The great cold is loosening its hold, but the world does not become warm all at once. There are long intervals of damp chill, returning cold, and gradual softening. Open tundra gives way in places to shrub, then to birch, pine, hazel, and oak. Animals shift with the vegetation. Reindeer, so important in colder phases, retreat northward as the land warms. Red deer, wild cattle, boar, elk, and smaller animals become more important in the changing forests and wetlands. The human body adapts through behavior first. Clothing, fire, movement, shelter, tool-making, and shared knowledge matter as much as inherited biology. Survival is cultural before it is genetic. Doggerland is especially rich because it is a meeting place of land and water. Rivers bring fish, birds, reeds, freshwater plants, and animals that come to drink. Marshes preserve tracks. Estuaries offer shellfish and seasonal abundance. Dry ridges make camps possible. In such a place, life can be mobile without being aimless. People may return to the same areas again and again, not as villagers in the later farming sense, but as communities with memory anchored to places. A bend in a river, a stand of trees, a flint scatter, a burial place, a hunting ground. These become part of a mental geography. The later sea erases the surface, but it does not erase the fact that this was once a lived human country. Modern science knows this world partly through fragments pulled from beneath the water. Fishing nets, dredging, seabed surveys, cores taken from marine sediments, and the careful work of archaeologists and geologists reveal pieces of the drowned plain. Flint tools appear where no dry land now exists. Animal bones emerge from the seabed, pollen trapped in sediments records changing vegetation. Ancient river channels are mapped under the North Sea floor. These are quiet forms of evidence, but together they restore a landscape. They show that the space between Britain and Europe was not an empty gap waiting to become sea. It was one of the great lowland environments of Mesolithic northwestern Europe. The transformation from connected land to island does not happen in a single moment. It is slow from the viewpoint of one human life, yet immense across generations. As the planet warms, ice melts, and seawater rises. At first, the change may be visible only at the edges. A familiar shoreline sits a little farther inland. A marsh grows where dry ground once lay. A path used by grandparents becomes unreliable in winter. A camp close to a river floods more often. Salt water enters freshwater spaces. Trees die in low places. Animals alter their routes. People adjust, as people always do. They move a little higher, a little farther, a little sooner in the season. But the direction of change does not reverse. This is one of the most important facts in the early history of Britain. The island is made by climate. It is not made by a wall, a conquest, or a choice. It is made by the return of water to the ocean after the Ice Age. The same warming that opens northern lands to forest and human life also begins to cut Britain away from the continent. The process is double-sided, generous, and separating at the same time. Land becomes more habitable, then less connected. Forests grow, animals spread, human communities flourish, and the sea slowly removes the old roots beneath them. By around 8,000 years ago, the geography has changed profoundly. The North Sea has expanded. The English Channel has taken shape. The land bridge is gone. Britain is now separate from the continent in a way that will shape everything after it. The crossing is still possible, but now it requires boats, weather knowledge, and intention. Casual movement becomes harder. Gene flow slows. Cultural exchange continues, but the rhythm is different. An island population begins to form, not because people stop moving entirely, but because movement now has a barrier. This barrier is subtle in its long-term effects. Island populations often experience stronger genetic drift, especially when communities are small. A trait that is rare on a large continent can become more common in a smaller, more separated population if the founding groups happen to carry it. Certain lineages can survive in one region while fading in another. Isolation does not freeze a population, but it changes the mathematics of inheritance. Over thousands of years, those small differences can become visible. The later distinctiveness of the British Isles has part of its foundation here, in the moment when a connected peninsula-like land becomes an offshore world. Yet, it would be wrong to imagine the newly formed island as empty, remote, or silent. Mesolithic Britain is forested, rivered, and alive. Human communities continue to hunt, fish, gather, make tools, shape shelters, and remember seasonal roots. They live in small numbers compared with later farming populations. But small numbers do not mean simple lives. Their world requires attention. Firewood must be chosen. Stone must be worked. Meat must be preserved or shared quickly. Children must learn which berries nourish and which harm. Storms must be read before they arrive. The dead must be handled according to meanings that are now mostly lost. A population can leave few monuments and still possess deep knowledge. The modern tendency is to value stone buildings more than vanished skill. But the people before Britain was an island survive in a changing world without fields, metal, writing, wheels, or permanent towns. They do so by carrying maps in memory and technology in the hand. A small flint blade is not a crude object. It is compressed intelligence, shaped from material chosen with care and used in tasks that connect the body directly to survival. A hearth is not merely ash. It is warmth, cooking, protection, gathering, and the center of social life. A path through wet woodland is not random movement. It is inherited knowledge made visible through walking. The story of Britain therefore begins not with kings or monuments, but with geography changing under human feet. Before the island has a name, the land is already teaching its inhabitants the conditions that will shape the future. Connection first, separation later. Movement first, then drift. A broad plain, then a shore. The buried rivers of Doggerland, the drowned camps, the animal bones under the seabed, and the flints lifted from the gray floor of the North Sea all point toward the same quiet truth. Britain begins as part of Europe, then becomes an island, and in that slow becoming, the first deep pattern of its human history is set. The shoreline does not vanish like a door closing. It withdraws, returns, softens, and advances again, leaving behind wet sand, dead roots, salt-stained grass, and the faint memory of paths that no longer lead where they used to lead. In Doggerland, the end of the land is not one event, but a long pressure. It comes through thawing ice far away, through rivers swollen with meltwater, through storms moving across a shallow sea, through the patient rise of water that makes familiar places uncertain. A hunting ground becomes marsh, a marsh becomes tidal flat, a tidal flat becomes water crossed only by birds. The people who live there do not watch an entire country disappear in a single lifetime, but they inherit the losses of those before them. Each generation receives a slightly smaller world. At first, the change may be almost ordinary. Low ground floods in wet seasons. Camps are moved to firmer soil. Reed beds spread where there had once been open grazing. The smell of the air changes near the coast, carrying more salt, more rot, more seaweed after storms. Freshwater pools turn brackish. Fish patterns shift. Red deer avoid certain places. Wild cattle keep to higher ridges. The people adapt because adaptation is the oldest human habit. Tools are carried. Children are lifted across wet channels. Fires are rebuilt where the ground stays dry. The map in memory is revised again and again. Yet there is a difference between a difficult season and a permanent transformation. Doggerland is slowly crossing that invisible line. The landscape itself is low, and that lowliness is its beauty and its weakness. It is a country of broad horizons, braided rivers, lakes, marshes, open grass, scattered woodland, and gentle rises that stand only a little above the surrounding plain. Such lands are generous when the sea is distant. They hold animals, fish, birds, edible plants, and routes of travel. But when sea level rises, a low country offers little resistance. Water does not need to climb cliffs. It only has to move inward, entering valleys first, then spreading through basins and channels. dividing one area from another until a familiar plain becomes a chain of shrinking islands. Dry ground remains, but it is no longer continuous. The old ease of movement is broken into crossings. There is a quiet human cost in that kind of change. A people who live by movement depend on predictable routes. Their knowledge is stored not in books or monuments, but in remembered sequences of place. A winter camp lies beyond a certain ridge. A flint source sits near a bend in the river. Hazelnuts ripen in a stand of trees reached after 2 days of walking. A shallow ford allows passage when water is low. When those places flood, the loss is not only practical, it is cultural. The land carries memory, and when the land disappears, memory has to detach from the ground that held it. The people of Doggerland are not merely relocating, they are watching parts of their inherited world become unreachable. Modern seabed research helps bring this lost geography back into view. Beneath the North Sea, scientists have traced buried river channels, ancient valleys, peat layers, and sediment patterns that once belonged to dry land. Sometimes fishermen and dredging crews recover bones of mammoth, aurochs, deer, and other animals from beneath the water. Worked flint appears in places where no human hand could have dropped it unless the sea had once been absent. Pollen grains preserved in old sediments reveal the spread of grasses, shrubs, and trees. These fragments do not speak loudly, but they agree with one another. They describe a country that was walked, hunted, settled in temporary ways, and gradually drowned. One of the most striking scientific insights is that the drowning of Doggerland is not just a local coastal change. It is part of the global reorganization after the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets over northern Europe, North America, and other regions had stored immense volumes of water. As the climate warms, that water returns to the oceans. The rise is uneven across time. Some periods are faster than others. Some coastlines adjust because land itself rebounds after the crushing weight of ice is removed. In the region around Britain, the combined effects of sea level rise, land movement, and storms reshape the entire future of the archipelago. The outline of Britain is therefore a product of climate history written into geography. There is also evidence for sudden violence within the broader slow process. Around a little more than 8,000 years ago, a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known today as the Storegga Slide, sends tsunami waves across parts of the North Atlantic and North Sea. By the time this occurs, much of Doggerland is already reduced, but some higher areas and coastal communities may still remain. The waves likely strike low-lying shores, flooding camps, marshes, and remaining islands. It is not the single cause of Doggerland's disappearance, but it may be one of the final blows to places already weakened by rising seas. The important point is calm, but firm. Landscapes can die by slow change and sudden force together. For the communities living through this transformation, retreat is not necessarily dramatic in appearance. It may look like choosing a safer camp. It may look like following animals inland. It may look like abandoning a place after repeated flooding. It may look like older people remembering routes that younger people never walk. Some groups move westward into what becomes Britain. Others move toward the continental coast, into the future Netherlands, Denmark, and northern Germany. Some remain as long as they can on higher ground. Over generations, the human network that once stretched naturally across the exposed plain becomes divided by water. The sea does not erase kinship at once, but it makes every crossing more deliberate. This is where the future island begins to matter biologically and culturally. When Britain is connected by land, movement can be gradual and frequent. People, ideas, mates, tools, and habits can spread across the open plain without a sea voyage. Once water separates Britain from the continent, movement still continues, but the barrier changes its rhythm. Boats are needed. Weather matters more. Crossings become riskier, more seasonal, and perhaps more socially meaningful. Even a narrow body of water can alter the fate of populations if it persists for thousands of years. It reduces casual contact. It allows drift to become stronger. It lets regional patterns deepen. An island begins not only as geography, but as a new set of probabilities. The creation of Britain as an island also changes how later migrations will arrive. Farmers cannot simply expand into Britain as they expand across continental valleys. They have to cross water. Bronze Age groups have to cross water. Traders, raiders, settlers, and armies all face the same fact in different ways. The surrounding sea becomes both road and wall. It protects, connects, filters, delays, and concentrates. This double nature is one of the great themes of British history. The sea prevents constant blending with the continent, yet it also invites those who know how to travel over it. Britain becomes distinct not because it is untouched, but because every arrival passes through a narrowing gate. In the drowned world of Doggerland, the first version of that gate is being formed. Water moves into valleys, birds settle on new lagoons, trees fall where roots are soaked by salt, fish enter places where deer once crossed. The soundscape changes from hoofbeats and wind over grass to gulls, waves, and the soft, sucking noise of tides in mud. The land does not protest. It simply yields, inch by inch, season by season, until the old roots lie under gray water. Beneath that water, the buried plain remains, holding pollen, bones, stone tools, and riverbeds like a memory sealed in silt. The vanished shoreline matters because it gives the British Isles their first deep separation. Before language, before monuments, before written history, before the names England, Scotland, Wales, or Ireland, the sea redraws the conditions of human life. The people who move onto higher ground carry older ancestry with them, but they now live inside a different geography. Their descendants will meet new arrivals, absorb new ways of life, and be transformed again and again. Yet the slow drowning of Doggerland remains the first great turn in the story, the moment when a connected world becomes an island world, and when the future of Britain begins to take shape beneath a rising tide. The First Britons do not step onto an empty stage. They emerge slowly from a world of retreating ice, flooded plains, dark forests, and narrow bands of dry land, where people learn to live with patience. They are not the first humans ever to reach the region, because older human presences come and go during warmer windows of the Ice Age. But after the last great cold begins to loosen, these Western hunter-gatherers become the first enduring human layer in the story of Britain. They live in the Mesolithic, after the Ice Age, but before farming, before metal, before stone circles, before the island is filled with fields. Their world is made of movement, memory, and close attention to living things. They belong to a broad population that archaeologists and geneticists often call Western hunter-gatherers. The name is technical, but the life behind it is intimate. These are people of riverbanks, caves, temporary shelters, woodland edges, estuaries, and seasonal camps. They travel through a Britain that is becoming more forested as the climate warms. Birch and pine give way in many places to hazel, oak, elm, and lime. The air holds the smell of leaf litter and damp bark. Streams run under shade. Red deer pass between trees. Wild cattle graze in clearings. Boar root in soft earth. Fish move through rivers that have not yet been straightened, dammed, polluted, or named by later kingdoms. Their tools are small, sharp, and efficient. Mesolithic flintwork often includes tiny blades and microliths, carefully shaped pieces that can be set into wood, bone, or antler to make arrows, barbs, and cutting tools. A small blade can hold a large amount of knowledge. Its shape reflects the hand that struck it, the stone selected for it, the task expected from it, and the experience of people who know how to turn a hard mineral into a useful edge. These objects survive because stone endures, but the greater part of their technology has vanished. Wooden shafts, woven fibers, hide containers, bark vessels, nets, traps, clothing, and shelters decay back into the soil. The archaeological record makes their world look poorer than it was. The missing materials were likely the very things that made daily life possible. The most famous face from this deep layer is Cheddar Man, found in Gough's Cave in Somerset. His remains date to around 10,000 years ago, making him one of the most important early human skeletons from Britain. Modern ancient DNA analysis suggests that he likely had dark skin, dark hair, and blue or blue-green eyes. This combination is one of the most useful corrections ancient DNA has offered to popular imagination. The earliest substantial inhabitants of post-glacial Britain were not pale in the way many later northern Europeans are pale. They carried pigmentation patterns that remind modern observers how recent many familiar appearances can be. In their bodies, dark skin and light eyes can exist together without contradiction. This matters because it shows that the story of appearance is not a straight line from ancient to modern. It is a history of changing frequencies. Skin color, eye color, hair color, and body form are shaped by many genetic variants, and those variants do not always travel together. Light eyes may be present before very light skin becomes common. Darker skin may remain for thousands of years in regions that are now imagined as naturally pale. What seems ancient in the modern mirror may be younger than expected. What seems surprising in a reconstructed Mesolithic face may once have been ordinary. Cheddarman is not important because he is an isolated curiosity. He matters because he helps reveal a population. Across Western Europe, ancient DNA has shown that many Mesolithic hunter-gatherers share a pattern of darker pigmentation and relatively high frequencies of blue-eye-associated variants. The exact appearance of any individual is always an estimate, not a photograph, but the larger pattern is clear enough to change the old picture. The first, lasting Britons belonged to a world before later farming ancestry, before steppe ancestry, before Anglo-Saxon ancestry, before Norse ancestry. They are an older foundation, mostly overwritten in later population events, yet never entirely erased. Their lives are often described by what they lack, but that is the least useful way to understand them. They do not have farms, but they have seasonal knowledge of plants and animals. They do not have permanent villages in the later Neolithic sense, but they return to meaningful places. They do not build stone monuments, but they leave traces of care, craft, diet, movement, and ritual. In some British caves and burial contexts, human remains suggest complex treatment of the dead. At Gough's Cave, older remains from around 14,700 years ago show evidence of butchery and possible cannibalism, a practice that may have carried ritual meaning rather than simple hunger. The evidence is unsettling, but it is also a reminder that deep prehistory contains social worlds whose meanings cannot be flattened into modern categories. The Mesolithic landscape teaches a different kind of intelligence from farming life. A farmer may know fields by ownership and season, but a hunter-gatherer knows a wider living web. The ripening of hazelnuts marks one moment of the year. The movement of salmon marks another. Deer antlers, bird migrations, fungi, berries, tides, and weather all become part of timekeeping. The calendar is not written on parchment. It is spread across the landscape. In a forested Britain, knowledge is heard in the sudden silence of birds, read in broken twigs, smelled in smoke and wet moss, felt in the softness of ground near water. The human mind is trained by attention. One of the richest known Mesolithic places in Britain is Star Carr in North Yorkshire, near what was once the edge of a lake. There, waterlogged conditions preserve rare organic materials that usually disappear. Archaeologists have found worked antler, barbed points, wooden objects, and red deer skull headdresses. These headdresses have attracted much attention because they suggest practices that may involve hunting, disguise, ritual performance, or both. The honest answer is that the full meaning is not known, but their presence shows that Mesolithic life includes symbolic behavior, crafted identity, and relationships with animals that are practical and imaginative at the same time. The red deer is not only meat, it is motion, antler, hide, tool, image, and perhaps spirit. This is a useful insight for the entire story of Britain. The first lasting inhabitants are not passive ancestors waiting to be replaced by more advanced people. They are successful human communities living within a demanding environment for thousands of years. Their population numbers are likely small compared with later farmers, but smallness does not mean failure. For a long time, their way of life fits the land. Forests, rivers, estuaries, and coasts provide what they need. If they move well and remember well, their world is low impact, not because they lack intelligence, but because their economy does not require the same transformation of soil, woodland, and animal life that farming will later bring. Their genetic legacy in modern Britain is small but meaningful. Later, population changes reduced the proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry dramatically, especially after the arrival of Neolithic farmers and later Bronze Age groups. Yet fragments remain. Some of the deep ancestry of modern populations in Britain and Ireland still reaches back through these people. The survival is not always visible in a direct way. It is not possible to point to one trait and assign it neatly to them, but their presence persists as an ancient layer within the larger mixture, like a dark band in the cliff face of time. The First Britons also matter because they establish the human relationship with the island before agriculture changes it. They know Britain as woodland and water, not as fields and boundaries. They live before the heavy clearing of forests, before cattle reshape grazing land, before cereals bind communities to fixed plots, before monuments draw labor into stone. Their Britain is older than the pastoral and farming imagination that later dominates the countryside. It is a Britain of tracks rather than roads, camps rather than villages, remembered places rather than mapped territories. In this early world, identity is probably local, relational, and mobile. People may know themselves through kin, season, place, animal, and repeated journey, rather than through the large ethnic names later projected backward onto prehistory. No one is English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Celtic, or British in the later sense. Those words are far in the future. What exists instead is human life close to the ground, passing through a landscape that is still changing after the ice, carrying genetic patterns that will one day seem unexpected, and leaving behind small, hard traces for a much later age to read. The First Britons are therefore both remote and strangely near. Their tools are different, their languages lost, their rituals mostly unreachable, and their world partly drowned or buried. Yet they belong to the same long human pattern of adapting to weather, raising children, reading landscapes, mourning the dead, and making meaning from animals, fire, stone, and water. They are not the finished answer to the modern face of Britain. They are the first deep layer beneath it, a population with dark skin and light eyes moving through green shade, before the fields arrive, before the great monuments rise, and before the island is changed again by people crossing the sea. The first farmers arrive not as an idea, but as a different way of touching the land. They bring cattle that breathe steam into cold morning air, sheep moving in small, restless clusters, grain stored in baskets and pits, polished stone axes, pottery, timber houses, and a new relationship with time. The older hunter-gatherer world follows the season across a wide living landscape. The farming world begins to hold people more tightly to particular places. A field has to be cleared, planted, watched, weeded, harvested, and remembered. A herd has to be guarded. A house has to be repaired. The soil becomes not simply ground underfoot, but an inheritance of labor. These people are part of the Neolithic expansion, a long movement of farming communities whose deepest origins lie far to the southeast, in and around Anatolia and the early agricultural regions of the Near East. By the time farming reaches Britain, it has already traveled slowly across Europe for thousands of years. It moves along river valleys, coastlines, and fertile plains. It changes as it travels, mixing with local populations, adapting to new climates, learning new soils, and carrying older domestic plants and animals into unfamiliar landscapes. When it finally crosses into Britain around 6,000 years ago, it is not a single ship, a single tribe, or a single dramatic arrival. It is a process, made of repeated crossings and gradual establishment. The sea that had once separated Britain from the continent now becomes a filter. Farmers cannot simply walk across Doggerland because Doggerland is gone. They cross water with intention. The movement requires boats, planning, animals, seed grain, and enough confidence to begin life again on an island where forests cover much of the land. The crossing itself is one of the quiet marvels of this period. Cattle do not cross seas by accident. Seed does not carry itself into new fields. The arrival of farming means people are not merely drifting into Britain, they are bringing a complete way of life, heavy with practical knowledge, social memory, and risk. The Britain they enter is still deeply wooded. Oak, elm, lime, hazel, and other trees form dense canopies in many regions. Light falls through leaves in broken patches. Underfoot, the soil is thick with roots, leaf mold, fungi, insects, and the damp smell of old growth. To farm such a place, people have to open it. Trees are cut, ring-barked, burned, and cleared. Stone axes bite into trunks again and again. Smoke rises from small clearings. Ash settles into soil. Sunlight reaches ground that had long been shaded. Grasses, cereals, and grazing animals begin to replace parts of the forest. The first farms are not gentle decorations on the landscape. They are acts of transformation. This change is not only economic, it alters the relationship between people and nature. Hunter-gatherers depend on wild abundance by moving through it. Farmers create abundance by narrowing attention to selected species. Wheat and barley matter in new ways. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats become living stores of meat, milk, hide, bone, labor, and wealth. The human world begins to gather around domesticated life. The field and the herd become centers of planning. The year is increasingly organized around sowing, birth, grazing, harvest, storage, and winter survival. Time becomes more circular, more bound to the return of crops and the management of animals. Ancient DNA shows that these farmers are not simply hunter-gatherers who learned to farm. They are largely descended from populations that had already carried agriculture across Europe from Anatolian roots. In Britain, their arrival brings a major change in ancestry. The older Western hunter-gatherer population does not vanish instantly, and there is some mixing, but over generations the farming population becomes dominant. The reason may not require a single war or massacre. Farming can support more people on the same amount of land. More food can mean more children. More settled life can mean more durable communities. A way of life that produces higher population density can slowly surround, absorb, and outnumber a way of life built on mobility. This replacement is one of the central insights of ancient DNA research. For a long time, archaeologists debated whether farming spread mainly as an idea or with migrating people. In Britain, the genetic evidence points strongly toward people. The new tools, pottery, crops, and monuments are not only copied by local hunter-gatherers, they arrive with communities whose ancestry differs clearly from the people already living there. Culture moves with bodies, and bodies carry culture into new soil. The island receives not merely a technique, but a population. Their appearance likely differs from that of the earlier hunter-gatherers. These Neolithic farmers probably have lighter skin on average than the Mesolithic people of Britain, though not necessarily as pale as many later northern Europeans. They more often have brown eyes. Their bodies, diets, and disease environments differ as well. Farming brings benefits, but it also brings burdens. Settled life can mean closer contact with animals, waste, and other people. It can increase exposure to infectious disease. It can make diet more dependent on a smaller range of foods. Bones from early farming populations in many regions sometimes show signs of hard labor, dietary stress, and new patterns of illness. Agriculture is not simply progress in a straight line. It is a bargain, powerful and costly. The landscape records this bargain. Forests are opened, soils are disturbed. Pollen records begin to show changes as woodland gives way in places to grasses and cultivated plants. The sound of the island changes. There is the chop of axes, the lowing of cattle, the soft movement of sheep, the crackle of controlled fire, the grinding of grain on stone. Houses stand longer in one place, paths deepen between clearings. Storage becomes important because crops must last beyond harvest. Food begins to accumulate in ways that can be protected, counted, shared, stolen, inherited, or displayed. Social life changes because stored wealth changes what people can owe and own. The Neolithic farmers also bring a new relationship with the dead. Across Britain and Ireland, long barrows, chambered tombs, and other funerary monuments begin to appear. The dead are not always treated as isolated individuals. Bones may be gathered, moved, arranged, revisited, and placed within structures that connect ancestry to land. This suggests communities thinking about belonging in a different way. A mobile group may remember many places across a range. A farming group may anchor memory more strongly to a particular territory. The tomb becomes a statement that the living belong here because the dead are here. Land, labor, ancestry, and identity begin to bind together. This is one of the unique transformations farming brings to Britain. It does not only change diet, it changes the imagination of place. A cleared field contains work from previous seasons. A herd contains inherited value. A tomb contains remembered bodies. A path connects house, field, pasture, and burial. Over time, these attachments make the landscape heavier with human meaning. Britain becomes less a terrain moved through and more a place claimed, shaped, and returned to. The roots of later territorial thinking lie partly in this shift, though it would be too simple to draw a straight line from Neolithic fields to modern borders. The deeper point is that farming teaches people to see land as something transformed by generations. Yet, the older hunter-gatherer world does not disappear from memory without trace. Some local knowledge almost certainly passes into the new society through contact and intermarriage. Farmers entering a wooded island would benefit from people who know rivers, animals, flint sources, plants, and weather. Even if the genetic contribution from hunter-gatherers becomes small, cultural fragments may persist in ways that archaeology can barely detect. A path remains useful after the people who first walked it are gone. A fishing place remains productive. A plant name may survive for a while, then vanish. Prehistory is full of such quiet transfers, where the record of bones and genes can see one part of the story, while daily knowledge passes in softer forms. The Neolithic transformation, therefore, creates a new Britain, but not from nothing. It overlays the older forest world with fields, herds, houses, and tombs. It changes the balance of ancestry. It increases population. It gives the island its first great monumental landscapes. It begins the long process by which human beings alter the British environment, not just by living within it, but by remaking it. The modern countryside, with its hedges, pastures, villages, and old field boundaries, is much later, but its distant ancestor is here, in the first clearings made by people who crossed the water with animals and seed. In the slow history of the British face and body, these farmers form the second major layer. They soften the older Mesolithic genetic profile, add ancestry from the farming expansion of Europe, and begin a new demographic reality on the island. They do not create modern Britain by themselves. Another great transformation will come later, and it will change the island even more sharply. But the Neolithic farmers give Britain its first settled rhythm. Under a sky of pale cloud and shifting rain, smoke rises from clearings, cattle press tracks into mud, grain dries near houses, and the island begins to learn the weight of fields. Stone rises slowly in the Neolithic landscape, not as a sudden invention, but as the visible form of a deeper change already taking place in soil, memory, and social life. Before the great stones stand in open grass, there are clearings made by axes, timber posts set into earth, ditches cut by antler picks, bones placed in chambers, and paths worn by repeated feet. The people who build these places are farmers, but farming alone does not explain them. A field feeds the body. A monument gathers time. It gives a community a place where the dead, the sky, the seasons, and the living can be brought into one slow pattern. The old idea that Neolithic people are simple collapses almost as soon as their monuments are understood with care. Stonehenge is often treated as the center of the story because its stones remain so visually powerful, but it is only one part of a much wider ceremonial world. Avebury encloses a huge circle of standing stones within a great bank and ditch. Newgrange in Ireland aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, allowing light to enter the passage and reach the chamber at a precise moment of the year. Skara Brae in Orkney preserves stone houses with beds, hearths, storage spaces, and a closeness to daily life so intimate that the village can feel less abandoned than paused. These places show planning, labor, observation, cooperation, and a long memory of landscape. The building of monuments begins long before the final famous form of Stonehenge. In the wider Salisbury Plain landscape, people dig ditches, raise banks, set posts, bury cremated remains, and mark spaces with repeated ritual use. The earliest phases of Stonehenge include a circular earthwork and timber or stone settings, with human remains placed in and around the site. Later, the larger sarsen stones and smaller bluestones become part of a complex structure whose construction requires transport, shaping, lifting, and alignment. None of this happens casually. It requires a community able to organize labor across seasons, feed workers, transmit plans, and maintain a shared belief that the work matters. The stones themselves carry a geography of effort. The great sarsens likely come from relatively nearer sources in southern England, still requiring difficult movement over land. The bluestones come from the Preseli Hills in Wales, much farther away. Their presence at Stonehenge has inspired long debate because their transport suggests either direct movement by people over great distances, the use of existing glacial movement in some interpretations, or a more complex history of stone selection and relocation. The precise details remain debated, but the broader fact is steady and clear. These stones are not random material. They are chosen, remembered, moved, and placed. Their distance gives them meaning. This is one of the unique insights of the Neolithic monument world. The value of a stone may not lie only in its size or durability. It may lie in where it comes from. A stone taken from a distant hill carries that hill into a new place. It brings memory, ancestry, root, and effort with it. In a world without writing, material itself can become a carrier of story. The bluestones may not simply be building blocks. They may be fragments of a meaningful landscape brought into another meaningful landscape, making Stonehenge not only a structure, but a gathering of places. Around these monuments, the sensory world is rich and grounded. Chalk dust clings to skin as ditches are cut into pale earth. Antler picks strike and scrape. Timber creaks under weight. Fires burn near camps. Cattle move across open ground. The smell of trampled grass, smoke, animal hide, wet wool, and turned soil gathers around seasonal meetings. There may be feasting in some areas, especially in the broader ceremonial landscapes connected to late Neolithic Britain, at Durrington Walls, near Stonehenge. Archaeological evidence suggests large gatherings, with animal bones and settlement traces pointing to repeated occupation and communal activity. The monument is not isolated silence. It is part of a living landscape of movement, food, labor, and return. Newgrange offers a different kind of stillness. Built more than 5,000 years ago in the Boyne Valley, it is older than Stonehenge's most famous stone arrangement and older than the pyramids of Giza. Its passage and chamber sit under a great mound, and at the winter solstice, sunlight enters through a carefully arranged opening and reaches into the darkness. The event lasts only a short time, but the architecture holds it across millennia. This alignment does not prove every detail of belief, but it shows careful observation of the solar year. The builders do not need written astronomy to know the sky. They watch, remember, compare, and build. The sun becomes part of the architecture. This matters for understanding Neolithic thought. These communities are not separating practical life from symbolic life in the way modern categories often do. Farming depends on season. Herding depends on birth cycles, grazing, winter fodder, and weather. The dead are placed in tombs that endure. The sun marks the year. The landscape holds ancestral places. In such a world, astronomy, agriculture, burial, and social memory can belong to one fabric. A solstice alignment is not merely a calendar trick. It may be a way of placing human life inside cosmic order, of making the return of light visible in stone and darkness. Skara Brae brings the view down from the sky to the floor of the house. In Orkney, stone-built homes are preserved with remarkable detail because stone lasts where timber would decay. The houses contain central hearths, box beds, storage furniture, and passageways. The rooms feel enclosed, practical, and human. Wind moves over the island outside. Sea air presses against the settlement. Inside, smoke stains the air above the hearth, and daily life gathers around warmth. Skara Brae reveals that Neolithic people are not only monument builders, they are household makers. They organize space, store goods, sleep beside walls, cook, repair, and live within crafted interiors. The connection between houses and tombs is one of the more subtle features of Neolithic Britain and Ireland. In some places, tomb architecture seems to echo domestic architecture, as if the dead are given houses of stone. This does not mean a simple belief can be reconstructed. It means that forms used for the living and the dead may share a symbolic language. The community may imagine ancestry as present, housed, visited, or held within the land. The dead are not always removed from social life. They may become part of how land is claimed, remembered, and stabilized. Monuments also reshape society by requiring cooperation beyond the household. A small family can clear a patch of land. A larger group is needed to build a mound, drag stones, dig a henge, or organize repeated gatherings. This labor may create social bonds as much as express them. Working together on a monument turns belief into muscle, time, and shared exhaustion. It creates stories of participation. It gives people a reason to gather from dispersed settlements. The monument becomes a social engine, not simply a finished object. There is a modern echo in this. Cities, cathedrals, memorials, national monuments, and even public squares continue to do something similar. They turn shared values into stone, steel, glass, and space. They tell people where to gather, where to remember, where to stand quietly. The Neolithic monuments of Britain are far older, but they belong to the same human habit of making memory visible. A monument says that a place matters beyond the needs of one day. It turns time into architecture. Yet the world that builds these stones is not timeless. The Neolithic farmers dominate Britain for many centuries, but their society will not remain unchanged forever. The monuments endure longer than the population patterns that created them. This is one of the most powerful lessons of ancient DNA. The people who build the great Neolithic ceremonial landscapes leave behind stones that still stand, but their genetic contribution to later Britain is greatly reduced after the next major transformation. Culture can be monumental, while ancestry is fragile. A society can shape the landscape and still be largely replaced in the biological record. The stones, therefore, hold a gentle paradox. They seem permanent, but they belong to a passing world. They rise from communities whose names are lost, whose languages are lost, whose songs are lost, and whose descendants become only one layer among others. Still, the work remains. Avebury's Circle, Newgrange's Chamber, Skara Brae's rooms, Stonehenge's stones, and the many less famous tombs and earthworks across the islands continue to mark the land. They are not primitive attempts at civilization. They are civilization in a different form, quiet, seasonal, ancestral, and bound to the sky. Through them, Neolithic Britain leaves behind not a written history, but a landscape that remembers. The Beaker turning point enters Britain with objects small enough to fit inside a grave, yet the change behind them is large enough to alter the island's ancestry for thousands of years. A beaker, shaped like an upside-down bell, lies beside a body. A copper dagger rests near the hand, a stone wrist guard, an archer's kit, a careful burial position, a mound above the grave, and sometimes ornaments of gold or amber mark a new way of presenting the dead. At first glance, these things may seem like style, the spread of a fashion across Europe, but beneath the pottery and metalwork lies one of the most profound population changes in the prehistory of Britain. The Beaker world is not born in Britain. It spreads across large parts of Europe during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, appearing from Iberia to Central Europe, from the Rhine to the Atlantic edge, and eventually across the water into the British Isles. The pottery gives the phenomenon its modern name, but the people associated with it are never only potters. They carry new burial customs, new personal ornaments, new metal objects, and in many regions, a new ancestry profile connected to populations with deep roots in the steppe grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. By the time this ancestry reaches Britain, it has already traveled through complex routes of movement and mixing across continental Europe. The steppe connection is one of the great discoveries of ancient DNA research. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists could see that the Beaker package spread widely, but the meaning of that spread was debated. Pottery can travel without people. Ideas can move through trade. A style can be adopted by neighbors. Ancient DNA changed the scale of the question. In Britain, the arrival of Beaker-associated groups is not merely a cultural borrowing. It is a major movement of people. Within a few centuries, the ancestry of the population changes so sharply that the earlier Neolithic genetic profile is almost overwhelmed. Many studies place the replacement at around 9/10 of the ancestry in some broad estimates. The exact number can vary by sample and model, but the direction is unmistakable. Britain, after the Beaker transition, is not the same biological population as Britain before it. This is not easy to see from the stones alone. Stonehenge still stands. Older monuments remain in the landscape. Long barrows, henges, and ceremonial places do not vanish from view. The ground still holds Neolithic memory. Yet the people living near those monuments are changing. This is the quiet paradox of the period. A landscape can remain continuous while the population within it shifts dramatically. The old monuments become inherited places, perhaps respected, reused, reinterpreted, or avoided by people whose ancestry differs strongly from that of the original builders. The stones do not move, but the human world around them is remade. The mechanism of this transformation remains one of the most interesting questions in British prehistory. The evidence does not require a single image of conquest in the simple sense. There is no need to imagine one dramatic invasion sweeping the island from shore to shore in a single season. Population change can happen through repeated movement, settlement, social advantage, disease, marriage patterns, and demographic expansion. The Beaker groups may arrive in waves. They may establish themselves in certain regions first. They may bring technologies, social networks, and ways of life that allow them to grow faster than the existing population. The earlier Neolithic communities may already be under pressure from environmental stress, soil exhaustion, disease, or internal change. Disease is a particularly important possibility, though it has to be handled carefully. Ancient DNA has found early forms of Yersinia pestis in parts of prehistoric Europe during roughly this broad era. This bacterium is known later as the cause of plague, though its ancient forms and transmission patterns are not necessarily the same as the medieval Black Death. If disease spreads through settled Neolithic farming communities, it could weaken populations and create openings for incoming groups. This is not a settled explanation for Britain on its own, but it is a powerful reminder that migrations do not happen in empty conditions. People move into landscapes already shaped by health, hunger, social stress, and climate. A genetic replacement can be the result of many small doors opening at once. The Beaker people bring with them a more individualized burial style than many earlier Neolithic traditions. Instead of collective tombs, where bones may be gathered and rearranged, Beaker graves often present single bodies with personal goods. The body is placed carefully, often crouched, with objects arranged in ways that suggest identity, gender, role, age, or status. This shift matters. It hints at a changing social imagination. The dead are no longer always folded into the collective ancestors in the same way. They can appear as individuals, accompanied by objects that mark who they are or who the living need them to be remembered as being. A grave becomes a small theater of identity, quiet and sealed under earth. Metal also changes the atmosphere of the age. Copper and then bronze do not immediately replace stone in every task, but they introduce new possibilities of craft, exchange, display, and power. Metal shines. It can be melted, shaped, repaired, recycled, and transformed. It carries value in a different way from flint. A copper dagger is not only a tool or weapon, it is a signal of connection to distant sources of ore, specialist knowledge, and exchange networks stretching beyond the local landscape. The world grows wider through material. A person buried with metal is buried with evidence of relationships that reach far beyond one field, one river, or one valley. The movement of Beaker-associated people also brings traits that later become important in the physical history of Britain. Their ancestry includes higher frequencies of genetic variants linked to lighter skin pigmentation compared with the earlier hunter-gatherers and many Neolithic farmers. This does not mean the modern British appearance appears all at once. It means the island receives a new biological starting point, one that later selection and drift can act upon. In the low sunlight environment of northwestern Europe, lighter skin can help with vitamin D synthesis, especially when diet and lifestyle create the right pressures. The Bell-Beaker transition therefore helps set the conditions for later pigmentation patterns, even though many generations are still required before modern frequencies take shape. Another important inheritance is connected with dairying. The ability to digest lactose into adulthood is not yet universal among Bell-Beaker populations, and its rise is complex, but the pastoral traditions associated with steppe-derived ancestry help create conditions in which lactase persistence becomes strongly favored over time. Cattle are not merely animals standing in the background of prehistory. They are walking stores of food, fat, hide, bone, horn, and social wealth. Milk is especially valuable in northern climates where food insecurity can return with winter. Over centuries, the cultural habit of dairying and the biological advantage of digesting milk begin to reinforce one another. Culture changes selection, and selection changes the future body. Height may also be affected by the new ancestry, though it is more complicated than a single trait. Steppe-related populations in Europe are often associated with genetic tendencies toward taller stature compared with some earlier farming groups. Diet, disease, childhood stress, and social conditions all matter, but the genetic layer is part of the pattern. The Bell-Beaker transition, therefore, does not only change graves and pottery, it helps alter the average body carried into later British history. Skin, stature, diet, burial, metal, and mobility are all connected through one broad transformation. The deeper insight is that the Bell-Beaker moment shows how prehistory works beneath visible culture. A pot can be copied, a burial style can be adopted, a dagger can be traded. But when ancient DNA is read from bones, it reveals whether the people themselves are changing. In Britain, they are. The island receives a new dominant ancestry, while the earlier Neolithic layer is greatly reduced. The people who built the great stone monuments do not disappear from memory, because their monuments remain, but their genetic presence becomes much thinner in the population that follows. This is not a moral story of better or worse people. It is a demographic story, calm and immense. After this turning point, the future of Britain runs along a new foundation. Later Iron Age communities, Celtic-speaking societies, Roman period towns, Anglo-Saxon settlements, Norse colonies, and medieval kingdoms will all unfold over a population already deeply shaped by the Bell-Beaker transformation. The modern genetic landscape of the British Isles cannot be understood without it. Beneath later languages and nations, beneath castles and churches, beneath written history, there is this older event. Graves under round barrows, bell-shaped vessels beside the dead, copper catching low light, cattle moving through damp grass, and a new ancestry spreading quietly across the island. Skin, milk, height, and winter light belong to the same quiet chapter of British prehistory. They are often treated as separate facts, as if appearance, diet, and body shape each follow their own isolated path. In reality, they gather around one deeper truth. Human bodies are not only inherited from ancestors, they are also shaped by landscapes, by food systems, by the angle of the sun, by the animals people keep close, and by the long pressure of survival repeated over many generations. After the Bell-Beaker transformation, Britain is inhabited by communities whose ancestry has shifted strongly toward a new Bronze Age foundation. That foundation carries traits and possibilities that the island's environment will slowly refine. The light of Britain is part of the story. It is not the sharp, high light of southern deserts or Mediterranean summers. It is lower, softer, often hidden behind cloud, mist, rain, and winter darkness. For much of the year, ultraviolet radiation is limited. Human skin needs ultraviolet light to help produce vitamin D, a nutrient essential for bones, immunity, and many functions of the body. Darker skin protects against intense sunlight, but in high-latitude regions, it can make vitamin D production more difficult when sunlight is weak. Lighter skin allows more ultraviolet light to penetrate. Over long periods, this can become an advantage. This does not mean pale skin appears suddenly or universally. Evolution does not work like a painter changing color in one stroke. It works through small differences in survival and reproduction. A child with stronger bones, a pregnant woman with better vitamin D levels, a family that survives repeated winters with slightly better health. These differences are quiet, almost invisible in any single generation, yet powerful across thousands of years. The variants associated with lighter skin increase in frequency not because the island chooses them, but because the conditions of the island make them useful. The Beaker and steppe-related ancestry already carries higher frequencies of some light pigmentation variants than the earlier populations of Britain. This creates a new starting point. The Western hunter-gatherers had often been darker-skinned. The Neolithic farmers were likely lighter than them on average, but still not identical to later Northern Europeans. The Bronze Age population moves the island further along the path toward lighter pigmentation. Then the climate, diet, and latitude of Britain continue to act on that inherited material. The modern result is not the legacy of one migration alone. It is migration plus selection, ancestry plus environment, biology plus sky. Milk tells the story in another form. Most humans in the world, and most humans across deep history, lose much of the ability to digest lactose after childhood. This is the usual mammalian pattern. Milk is food for infants. Yet in parts of Europe, especially northern and northwestern Europe, adult lactase persistence becomes unusually common. Britain becomes one of the regions where this trait eventually reaches very high frequency. That fact is not a small dietary footnote. It is a sign of a world where cattle matter deeply. A Bronze Age landscape with cattle is a landscape of stored life. Grain can fail in wet seasons. Hunting can become uncertain. But cattle can turn grass into milk, meat, hide, horn, bone, and status. Milk is especially important because it can be taken without killing the animal. It offers fat, protein, liquid, and calories. It can be consumed fresh by those who tolerate it, or transformed into foods that reduce lactose, such as fermented products and cheeses. In a cool, damp climate, where pasture can be rich and growing seasons can be difficult, dairy becomes a quiet form of security. The unique insight here is that culture creates the pressure that biology then answers. People begin to keep cattle and value dairy for social and economic reasons. Once milk becomes important, individuals who can digest it into adulthood gain an advantage. Over generations, the genetic variant that keeps lactase active becomes more common. This is gene-culture coevolution, one of the clearest examples in human history. A habit of living changes the body's future. The herd outside the settlement becomes part of the genome inside the body. Height follows a broader and more complex path. It is not controlled by one gene, and it cannot be explained only by ancestry. Thousands of genetic variants contribute to stature, and childhood nutrition, infection, labor, and inequality all shape the body. Still, ancient DNA suggests that steppe-related ancestry is associated in Europe with genetic tendencies toward greater height compared with some earlier farming populations. After the Beaker transition, Britain receives more of this ancestry. The effect is not simple, but it becomes one ingredient in the later physical profile of the island. The Bronze Age body is therefore a meeting point of old and new pressures. It carries ancestry from the steppe, remnants of Neolithic farmers, and smaller traces of older hunter-gatherers. It lives under northern light. It depends increasingly on domesticated animals and cultivated land. It faces disease environments shaped by settlement, herding, and contact. It grows through childhoods that vary by food supply, season, labor, and social position. The body is never just genetic. It is an archive of conditions. Red and auburn hair belong partly to this wider Atlantic story, though their strongest later frequencies develop through a mixture of ancient variants, drift, and regional isolation. Variants in the MC1R gene can shift pigment production toward reddish tones and very fair, freckled skin. These variants appear at unusual frequencies along the Atlantic fringe, especially in Ireland, western Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and nearby regions. The explanation is not a single cause. Founder effects, small population sizes, island and peninsula geography, and weak or complex selection all likely play roles. A rare trait can become common when a small community carries it forward through many generations with limited outside mixing. This is why the western edges of the British Isles matter so much. They are not remote in a cultural sense, because people travel by sea, trade, raid, marry, and migrate. But they can be partially isolated in genetic rhythm. Mountains, peninsulas, islands, and rough seas shape who meets whom often and who remains more local. In such places, uncommon traits can gather and persist. Red hair becomes not simply a color, but a visible sign of demographic history, a small flame carried through the damp Atlantic air. Blue and gray eyes have another story again. The main blue eye-associated variant near the OCA2 gene is ancient in Europe and reaches high frequencies in parts of northern and western populations. Britain and Ireland inherit this through multiple layers, including older hunter-gatherer ancestry and later Northern European contributions. Eye color is not strongly tied to skin color in a simple way. This is why early Western hunter-gatherers can plausibly have dark skin and light eyes, while later populations combine light eyes with lighter skin more often. The modern pairing feels natural only because history has made it common. The larger pattern is that the British Isles become a place where several traits rise together, but not for one reason. Pale skin is shaped strongly by latitude and vitamin D. Lactase persistence is shaped by dairying and cattle culture. Height reflects ancestry and environment. Red hair reflects drift, old variants, and Atlantic edge population structure. Blue eyes reflect ancient European variation and later demographic layering. The modern body is not a single message. It is a bundle of histories. There is a quiet, modern connection in this. A person walking through a supermarket aisle, choosing milk, wearing sunscreen, carrying genes that influence eye color or freckling, is moving through the afterlife of prehistoric conditions. The body that burns in weak northern sun is linked to the same light that once favored vitamin D production. The ability to drink milk connects to cattle kept by Bronze Age communities on damp pastures. The freckles that appear after summer days are tied to pigment systems shaped by ancestry and selection. Ancient history is not only in ruins, it is present in ordinary biology. This part of the story also warns against simple explanations. No modern population is the direct copy of one ancient group. No visible trait belongs completely to one migration. The features associated with Britain and Ireland today are made through layering. Mesolithic foundations, Neolithic farming ancestry, Beaker transformation, later regional drift, and later arrivals still to come. The Bronze Age does not finish the story, but it establishes some of the strongest conditions for what follows. In the soft gray climate of the island, cattle graze in wet fields. Children grow under low winter light. Milk is drawn from living animals, and the human body slowly carries the landscape inward. The Iron Age in Britain does not arrive as a clean replacement of one people by another. It settles over the Bronze Age world like a new weather, changing tools, settlements, warfare, farming, craft, and language, while much of the older population remains in place. This is one of the most important corrections to the popular imagination. The word Celtic often makes the period feel like an invasion story, as if a distinct people suddenly enters the island and gives it a new identity. The evidence is quieter than that. Iron Age Britain is not a simple arrival. It is a long transformation of communities already rooted in the island, shaped by contact, exchange, local development, and ideas moving across Europe. Iron itself changes the texture of daily life. Bronze requires copper and tin, materials that depend on particular sources and exchange networks. Iron ore is more widely available, though working it well requires heat, skill, and experience. In a smith's hearth, dark ore becomes bloom, then tool, blade, nail, fitting, or plowshare. The process is smoky, hot, and physical. Charcoal burns, bellows breathe. Hammer blows fall in a steady rhythm. Iron does not instantly make life easy, but it makes certain kinds of work more available. Stronger tools help clear land, cut wood, shape farms, and make weapons. The metal enters the field, the workshop, and the body of society. The landscape of Iron Age Britain is increasingly open in many regions. Forests remain, especially in less intensively farmed areas, but fields, trackways, enclosures, and settlements spread across the countryside. Roundhouses stand with timber posts, wattle walls, thatch, clay floors, and central hearths. Smoke rises through roof spaces. Grain is stored in pits or raised structures. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses move through managed land. The soundscape is no longer the Mesolithic forest or the early Neolithic clearing. It is a worked countryside, filled with animals, tools, footsteps, wheels, voices, and the constant small labor of keeping a farm alive. Hill forts become one of the most visible signs of the period. Some stand on high ridges, their banks and ditches cutting strong lines across the land. Others are lower or more complex, and not all serve the same purpose. The old habit is to imagine them mainly as military forts, but that is too narrow. Many hill forts are places of gathering, storage, display, craft, trade, power, ritual, refuge, or seasonal assembly. Their earthworks are practical, but they are also visual. A bank on a hill tells the surrounding land that this place is marked. It gathers people's attention long before they reach the entrance. This is a useful insight for understanding Iron Age society. Power is not only held in palaces or written laws. It can be held in visibility, cattle, feasts, metalwork, control of routes, and the ability to bring people together. A hill fort may dominate a valley not only because it can resist attack, but because it organizes the landscape around itself. People below see it at dawn and dusk. Tracks bend toward it. Goods move through it. Decisions may be made there. Memories gather there. Its earth banks become a slow statement of community, status, and belonging. The people of Iron Age Britain speak languages that belong to the Celtic branch of the Indo-European family, though the exact routes by which those languages spread remain debated. It is possible that Celtic languages arrived through earlier Bronze Age networks, later continental contacts, or a combination of both. What matters for this story is that language change does not always require total population replacement. A language can spread through trade, prestige, marriage, elite influence, migration, or gradual cultural adoption. The genetic evidence suggests broad continuity from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age in Britain. The people may change how they speak and organize society without becoming an entirely new biological population. The Picts of northern Scotland show how easily later imagination can turn regional difference into mystery. Roman and later writers describe peoples in the north with names that become heavy with legend. Carved stones, symbols, and the later scarcity of written records make the Picts seem distant and unusual. Yet recent genetic work suggests that they are not a strange, separate population outside the story of Britain. They are broadly connected to Iron Age and early medieval populations of the region, with local patterns shaped by geography. Their distinctiveness is real, but it is regional, not otherworldly. The far north preserves difference because distance, landscape, and local continuity matter. This is the deeper pattern of Iron Age Britain. It is not one uniform culture spread evenly across the island. It is a mosaic. Southern Britain is closer to continental exchange routes. Eastern regions look across the North Sea. Western and northern regions preserve older patterns more strongly in some respects. Coastal communities may be outward-looking by sea, while inland communities are organized around valleys and uplands. Ireland follows a related but separate path. never becoming Roman in the way southern Britain later does. The islands are connected, but not identical. They are a web of regions, not a single block. Archaeology reveals a society rich in craft and symbolism. Iron Age metalwork can be highly refined, with flowing designs, curved forms, mirrors, shields, torques, and decorated objects that show technical control and visual imagination. The art is not naturalistic in the classical Mediterranean sense. It often favors curves, spirals, hidden faces, and patterns that seem to move like water or vine tendrils. This difference matters. It shows that sophistication does not have one style. A Roman statue and a Celtic metal mirror express different artistic worlds. One is not the childhood of the other. They are separate ways of ordering beauty. Food and farming also reveal complexity. Iron Age communities cultivate cereals, manage livestock, store surplus, and maintain networks of exchange. Salt production becomes important in some coastal and inland brine areas because salt preserves meat and fish, supports diet, and carries trade value. Quernstones grind grain by hand. Pottery styles vary by region. In some areas, coins begin to appear before the Roman conquest, influenced by continental models, but adapted locally. Coinage suggests exchange, status, political authority, and contact with wider European systems. Britain before Rome is not isolated darkness. It is already entangled with Europe. The body in Iron Age Britain continues the genetic story from the Beaker transformation. The population is still largely built on Bronze Age ancestry, with regional additions and local drift. The traits that later become associated with the British Isles are still being shaped by environment and demography. There is no single Iron Age face. There are farmers in chalk landscapes, communities in wet western valleys, people in northern uplands, coastal traders, island groups, and riverine settlements. Skin tone, hair color, height, and eye color vary, but the deeper ancestry remains connected to the post-Beaker foundation. The modern connection lies in the survival of regional identity. Wales, Cornwall, parts of Scotland, Ireland, and other Atlantic regions later preserve Celtic languages or cultural memory more strongly than much of eastern and southern England. This does not mean they are untouched relics of the Iron Age, but it does mean geography helps continuity endure. Mountains, peninsulas, western coasts, and island chains can slow certain changes while allowing others to pass through. Modern cultural maps often carry the shadow of much older landscapes. Language, ancestry, and place do not perfectly overlap, but they often lean in the same direction. The Iron Age also prepares the island for the shock of written history. Roman observers will describe Britain through their own categories, often misunderstanding or simplifying what they see. But before those descriptions arrive, the island already has deep social structures: farms, elites, roads of exchange, sacred places, skilled craftspeople, warriors, herders, and communities with long memories. Rome will not bring history to an empty place. It will enter a world already old. In the calm order of the long story, Iron Age Britain is a hinge. It preserves much from the Bronze Age, absorbs ideas from the continent, develops regional societies, and carries Celtic languages into the historical record. Its people are not the First Britons, and they are not the final source of modern Britain. They are one more layer, broad and important, living in roundhouses under thatched roofs, watching smoke rise from hearths, moving cattle through wet fields, shaping iron and fire, and building hill forts whose banks still rest on the hills like quiet folds in the earth. Rome enters Britain as stone, road, law, heat, writing, and discipline, but not as a new bloodstream poured deeply through the whole island. The conquest begins in the 1st century of the Common Era, when imperial power crosses the Channel and presses inland through territories already shaped by Iron Age communities. Soldiers march under heavy equipment, surveyors mark lines across fields and hills, forts rise first in timber and earth, then sometimes in stone. Roads cut across older tracks with a new straightness, indifferent to many local curves of land. The Roman world does not simply arrive with swords, It arrives with measurement. The landscape begins to change in ways that are still visible nearly 2,000 years later. Roads run from ports to towns, from towns to forts, from forts to frontiers. Villas appear in some rural areas with painted walls, tiled roofs, mosaics, bath suites, and underfloor heating. Towns grow around grids, markets, temples, workshops, administrative buildings, and public baths. Latin appears on inscriptions, tablets, altars, tombstones, and military records. Coins move through hands. Pottery from distant kilns reaches British settlements. Olive oil, wine, and fine tableware travel along imperial networks. The island is no longer only a northern place of farms, hill forts, and regional exchange. It is now connected to an empire that stretches around the Mediterranean and beyond. The sensory difference must have been considerable. In a Roman town, smoke rises from workshops and kitchens. Wet wool, horse dung, metal, bread, oil, and sewage mix in narrow streets. Bathhouses carry warm, damp air, the smell of heated stone, skin, oil, and steam. In a villa, a floor warmed by a hypocaust feels unlike the cold earth of a roundhouse. In a military fort, leather, iron, sweat, cooked grain, and sharpened discipline gather behind walls. The Roman presence changes not only politics, but the texture of daily life for those close enough to touch it. Yet the deepest insight of Roman Britain is that cultural transformation and genetic transformation are not the same thing. Rome changes Britain profoundly without replacing most of its people. The province contains immigrants from across the empire, and some are genetically diverse. Soldiers, merchants, enslaved people, administrators, craftspeople, and families arrive from Gaul, the German provinces, the Danube, Iberia, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and other regions. Some die in Britain. Some have children there. Some leave descendants. Ancient DNA from Roman period burials has revealed individuals with ancestry far beyond the local island population. This diversity is real and important, but the numbers operate differently at the level of the whole population. The native population of Britain is large compared with the incoming imperial layer. Roman soldiers and officials may dominate forts, towns, and administration, but much of rural Britain remains inhabited by local communities whose ancestry descends mainly from earlier British populations. Even when Roman culture spreads, genes do not necessarily spread at the same scale. A local family may use Roman pottery, pay taxes in Roman systems, sell goods to a Roman market, live near a road, or adopt Latin names without becoming biologically Roman in any broad sense. Culture can flow faster than ancestry. This is the reason the Roman genetic shadow is thin. The empire is heavy in stone but lighter in demographic weight. Roads endure, walls endure, place names and archaeological layers endure. But the island's population is not remade in the way it was during the Beaker transition. The Beaker change reaches deeply into ancestry. The Roman change reaches deeply into infrastructure, administration, economy, and identity. These are different kinds of power. One changes the body of the population. The other changes the world around the body. Hadrian's Wall shows this contrast clearly. It stretches across northern Britain as a line of imperial control, with forts, mile castles, ditches, roads, and garrisons. It is one of the most striking Roman structures in the island, yet it also reveals how thin and organized Roman power can be. Soldiers stationed there may come from different parts of the empire. Their inscriptions preserve names, units, gods, and origins. They live at the edge of a province, facing northern peoples who remain outside direct Roman rule. The wall is massive in stone, but it is still a frontier held by relatively small numbers of people compared with the countryside behind and beyond it. Roman towns also concentrate diversity. Places like Londinium, Eboracum, and other urban centers draw people because administration and trade gather there. A burial ground in such a city can preserve individuals with different diets, origins, and life histories. Isotopes in teeth may show childhood spent elsewhere, DNA may show ancestry from warmer or more distant regions. Grave goods may show mixed cultural habits. These lives matter because they prevent a false image of Roman Britain as only local Britons wearing Roman clothing. The province is connected, mobile, and more varied than older national stories often allow. At the same time, most people in Roman Britain probably continue to live in rural settings. They farm, herd, repair tools, manage animals, and move through local landscapes that had been occupied long before the legions arrived. Some houses change form. Some settlements adopt Roman goods. Some elites use villas and inscriptions to display status. But in many places, daily life remains a blend. Roman Britain is not a uniform blanket laid over the island. It is patchy, dense in some zones, thin in others, embraced by some, resisted or ignored by others, and adapted into local forms almost everywhere. The unique modern connection lies in the way institutions can transform life without transforming ancestry. A contemporary city can change its language of power, its roads, its laws, its currency, its architecture, and its habits through empire, trade, or globalization, while much of its local population remains continuous. Roman Britain is an early example of this separation. Identity can be reclothed faster than ancestry can be replaced. A person may live in a Roman province, use Roman coins, worship a Roman or blended deity, and still descend mostly from Iron Age British families. The name of the world changes around the person. The same distinction matters in the story of appearance. The Roman period adds diversity, especially in towns and forts, but it does not create the broad traits later associated with the British Isles: pale skin, blue or gray eyes, red hair frequencies, lactase persistence, and many regional patterns are not primarily Roman gifts. They are older or later in their main development. Rome adds people, but not enough across the whole island to erase the Bronze Age and Iron Age foundation. In genetic terms, Roman Britain is a layer of contact rather than a new base. This does not make the Roman period unimportant. It is crucial precisely because it shows that history is not only genes. Roads reshape movement, towns reshape trade, writing reshapes memory, coins reshape value, law reshapes obligation, military frontiers reshape political geography. The Roman centuries leave structures of thought and land use that influence later Britain even after imperial authority withdraws. Some roads remain useful for centuries. Some towns survive in altered form. Some Christian communities may have roots in the late Roman world. The island's future is marked by Rome, even where the genome barely moves. When Roman administration weakens and finally withdraws in the early 5th century, the province does not simply return to what it was before. Roads remain under grass and traffic. Walls stand even when no imperial officer commands them. Towns shrink, change, or continue in reduced forms. Rural communities adapt again. The old British population, still carrying its deeper ancestry, remains beneath the ruins of imperial order. The stone world fades unevenly, but it does not vanish at once. Britain, after Rome, is neither Roman nor purely pre-Roman. It is a landscape of leftovers. The thin genetic shadow of Rome is therefore one of the most instructive parts of the island's story. It teaches that visible power is not always demographic power. An empire can build cities, heat floors, cut roads, move armies, write laws, and leave inscriptions across stone, yet still contribute only lightly to the ancestry of the majority population. In the long making of Britain, Rome is a brilliant surface layer over an older body. Its roads lie straight across the land. Its walls hold the memory of command. Its towns carry the smell of smoke, bathwater, market stalls, and whetstone, while beneath them, the deeper island population continues, waiting for the next migration that will reach more strongly into the east of the island and alter the pattern again. The Anglo-Saxon migration changes Britain in a different way from Rome. Rome leaves roads, walls, towns, coins, and written records, yet its genetic shadow is light. The Anglo-Saxon movement is less monumental in stone at first, but it reaches more deeply into ancestry, especially across eastern and southern England. It begins after Roman authority weakens and the old province loses the structure that had held its towns, taxes, armies, and frontiers together. Into that unsettled landscape come Germanic-speaking groups from across the North Sea, from regions now connected with northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. They arrive into a Britain that is not empty. Romano-British communities remain, farming the land, speaking Brittonic languages, remembering Roman habits in some places, and older local traditions in others. The new arrivals do not simply erase them everywhere. The more accurate image is a patchwork forming slowly across generations. In the east, the continental ancestry becomes especially strong. Farther west, older British ancestry remains more visible. Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north preserve deeper continuity, while eastern England turns more strongly toward the North Sea world. Ancient DNA has made this pattern clearer. Cemeteries associated with early Anglo-Saxon material culture show individuals with substantial continental northwestern European ancestry, often mixed with local British ancestry. Some graves contain people whose ancestry is mostly continental. Others show mixture. Some local people may adopt Anglo-Saxon customs, burial styles, names, or language without having the same ancestry. Culture and biology overlap, but they do not match perfectly. The cemetery becomes a place where identity is performed in objects, clothing, burial position, and community memory, while the bones carry another record beneath it. The modern insight is that England forms not from total replacement, but from uneven blending. The English language spreads widely, and that makes the change feel complete in later history. Yet genes show a softer, more regional process. A language can become dominant through power, settlement, prestige, marriage, landholding, and children growing up inside new social worlds. It does not require every earlier family to vanish. The old population can remain while its speech changes. In the fields and river valleys of early medieval Eastern Britain, the shift is quiet but lasting. Timber halls stand near farms. Graves hold brooches, beads, weapons, knives, combs, and pottery. Smoke rises from settlements where older island ancestry and newer continental ancestry begin to share descendants. The result is not one pure people replacing another, but a new population forming along the eastern edge of the island, shaped by migration, mixture, and the long pull of the North Sea. The Viking Age adds another northern layer to Britain, but its pattern is uneven. It does not fall across the whole island in the same way. It arrives by sea, following winds, currents, rivers, and the old habit of looking outward from cold coasts. Ships move across the North Sea with shallow drafts and flexible routes. They can raid a monastery, enter a river, reach a market, settle a farm, or connect distant islands into one maritime world. The sea that separates Britain from Scandinavia also becomes the road that joins them. In eastern and northern England, Scandinavian settlement leaves a detectable but moderate imprint. The Danelaw becomes a zone where Norse and Danish influence enters law, place names, farming communities, trade, and ancestry. York, known in this world as Jorvik, grows into a busy center of craft and exchange. Streets carry the smell of wood smoke, leather, fish, damp wool, and worked bone. Coins, combs, weights, tools, and imported goods pass through hands. The Viking presence is not only violence. It is settlement, trade, marriage, and ordinary life, repeated until foreignness becomes local. The genetic signal in much of England is real, but often difficult to separate from earlier Anglo-Saxon ancestry because both come from related northwestern European populations. This is one of the important scientific details. Similar ancestries can blur into one another. A Danish settler and an Anglo-Saxon descended local may not be easy to distinguish genetically after many generations. The historical event is clear, but the biological signal can be subtle. In Orkney and Shetland, the pattern is much stronger. These northern islands become deeply Norse in language, culture, and ancestry. The earlier population is partly or largely replaced, and modern Orcadian ancestry still carries a strong Scandinavian component. The islands preserve this because geography concentrates history. Sea routes connect them northward, while distance sets them apart from mainland Scotland. Wind, rock, pasture, and ocean make a world where Norse settlement becomes not a thin layer, but a lasting foundation. The Viking contribution, therefore, teaches the same lesson in a new form. Migration is never one size everywhere. It can be faint in one region, strong in another, nearly invisible in a third. In Britain, the Norse layer survives most clearly at the northern edge, where grey sea surrounds low green land. Old farmsteads face the wind, and the island story turns once more towards Scandinavia. Ancient DNA changes the story of Britain because it allows the dead to become evidence in a new way. For centuries, the deep past had to be read through tools, pottery, monuments, bones, burial positions, and the shape of skulls. Those clues still matter, but they can mislead when used alone. A pot can travel without a person. A burial custom can be copied. A language can spread without replacing a population. DNA adds another layer, hidden inside bone, where ancestry leaves a quieter record. The most valuable place to find that record is often the petrous bone, a dense part of the skull near the inner ear. It protects ancient DNA better than many other bones. In a laboratory, a tiny sample can reveal relationships across thousands of years, showing whether a person belongs mostly to the older hunter-gatherer layer, the Neolithic farming layer, the Beaker transformation, or later movements. The process is delicate because old DNA is damaged, fragmented, and easily contaminated. Yet when enough samples are compared, the pattern becomes visible. This is how Cheddar Man becomes more than a skeleton in a cave. This is how the Beaker transition becomes more than a change in pottery. This is how Anglo-Saxon cemeteries become more than rows of graves with brooches, beads, and weapons. Each body carries two histories at once. One is the cultural history shown by objects. The other is the biological history preserved in ancestry. Sometimes they match, sometimes they do not. That difference is where some of the most interesting truths appear. The unique insight is that ancient DNA does not replace archaeology. It corrects and deepens it. It turns old debates into more careful questions. It shows that Neolithic farming in Britain arrives largely with people, not only ideas. It shows that Beaker Britain is transformed more strongly than monuments alone would suggest. It shows that Anglo-Saxon England is mixed, regional, and uneven, rather than simply conquered or unchanged. In a quiet laboratory, under clean light, the island's vanished populations are read from powder, taken from bone. The result is not a family tree with one trunk, but a braided river. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe-descended, Bronze Age people, Iron Age communities, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Norse settlers, and later arrivals all leave different currents. The modern face of Britain becomes understandable not as a fixed identity, but as a living surface above many buried streams. The island remains inside the genome, not as a single bloodline, but as a record of crossings, separations, survivals, and returns. Pale skin reflects northern light and the long need to make vitamin D under cloudy skies. Blue and gray eyes carry older European variants that rise and persist through layered ancestry. Red and auburn hair gather most strongly along the Atlantic fringe, where islands, peninsulas, mountains, and distance allow rare traits to remain visible. Lactase persistence speaks of cattle, milk, pasture, and the ancient partnership between human culture and biological selection. Height carries the combined influence of ancestry, nutrition, childhood health, and the deep Bronze Age reshaping of the island. None of these traits tells the whole story alone. A face is not a map that can be read with perfect certainty. A hair color does not reveal one pure origin. A region does not hold one untouched people. The truth is more intricate and more human. Britain and Ireland are made from many older worlds pressed together. The hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic forests, the farmers from the Neolithic clearings, the Beaker communities with steppe-related ancestry, the Iron Age societies of hill forts and fields, the thin but vivid Roman layer, the Anglo-Saxon patchwork of the East, the Norse imprint of northern islands and coasts. Different regions preserve different balances. Wales retains strong continuity with older British layers. Ireland carries its own Atlantic island history, rich in ancient ancestry and regional drift. Scotland is varied from lowland to highland to island edge. Orkney and Shetland hold a clear northern memory of Norse settlement. England itself is not one genetic surface, but a gradient, with stronger continental northwestern European influence in parts of the east and more older British continuity toward the west. The deeper lesson is calm and simple. The British Isles are not the story of a people kept pure by the sea. They are the story of a place shaped by the sea. Water separates, but it also carries boats. It slows contact, but it concentrates arrivals. It protects some local patterns, then opens the shore to strangers who become ancestors. The modern face of Britain is therefore a loafing shoreline. Behind it lie drowned plains, forest camps, cattle fields, stone circles, barrow graves, Roman roads, timber halls, Norse harbors, and quiet graves whose bones still hold old signals. The island is not one memory. It is many memories layered together, still visible in ordinary bodies beneath the soft northern light.